So I'm delighted to introduce Sam West, whose talk today forms part of Lincoln Live, our current season of activity, a celebration of performance ventures that stand resolutely marginal to both the history of English theatre and the often exclusive disciplinary rhetoric of contemporary performance arts. This is also part of our monthly Lincoln Creates Network programme, which brings together and celebrates the breadth of critical and applied creative practices in Lincolnshire and beyond. The series is designed to support local creative professional development, peer learning and networking, as well as critical conversation and debate. Over the last 3 years, in the role of curator at University of Leicester's Attenborough Arts Centre, Sam West has worked with artists that use performance, film and photography to explore the politics of the body and identity. Sam started his PhD at Loughborough University in the School of Design and Creative Arts in October 2019. Funded through the Storytelling Academy, Sam's research is focused on applied storytelling in independent professional wrestling. And in 2017, Sam co-founded the theatre-led independent wrestling company, Wrestling Resurgence. In this talk, Sam will combine research into the independent wrestling community and practice-based knowledge gained from producing live wrestling events. Professional wrestling is one of the most misunderstood forms of popular entertainment, too theatrical to be accepted as a sport and too sporty to be considered theatre. And yet it is obviously artistic and clearly athletic. This talk seeks to unravel wrestling's many fascinating contradictions and trace its connections to many other more established forms of artistic expression. Sam will also discuss urgent research into the outlook for professional wrestling, which, like many other performance-based practices and forms of popular entertainment, has been radically affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Right now, I'm going to hand over to Sam.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Colette. That was really great. I'm just going to do shared screen, so I've got a bit of a PowerPoint presentation.
Great.
Okay, should be able to see that.
Yep, can see that.
Okay, so to start with, this photo was taken at one of our live events that Wrestling Resurgence produced. It was in December 2019, and it was right at the end of the show. It was the end of our first full year as a wrestling company, and I just wanted to start there, and then sort of rewind the clock and look at the different things that got me to this point. And particularly my kind of arts and curatorial background. So before getting into wrestling, I worked for approximately 10 years in contemporary art in various different roles. Initially at Attenborough Arts Centre initially at Nottingham Contemporary, and then as a kind of independent sort of freelance curator. And most recently, for the last sort of 5 years, I worked at Attenborough Arts Centre in Leicester. And at Attenborough Arts Centre in Leicester, my curatorial practice sort of started to deal a lot with identity politics. So Attenborough Arts Centre as an organisation had a remit to celebrate diversity in lots of different ways through contemporary art. And this kind of inevitably led to an interest in performance art and the presentation of the body in film and performance art and video. And also in photography. So before just delving into some wrestling, I want to just highlight a couple of projects that happened around the same time that I started to become interested in wrestling from a kind of curatorial arts perspective. And it was this one, which is a project with an artist called Marty Golding, who's based in Brighton, who makes film, photography, and sculpture. And this project, which was by the performance artist Aaron Williamson, and you can see here quite an obvious, less subtle move into combining wrestling and art, because Aaron actually worked with some of the wrestlers that we worked with to produce his work. And so going back to Marty, in the body body is a sort of identity marker, physicality, things like that, has its roots in contemporary art. So why wrestling? So alongside this curatorial work, I've been a lifelong fan of professional wrestling. I can remember watching wrestling from an incredibly early age, so maybe 4 or 5, on television. And it's kind of a fandom that's been with me most of my life, right through to adulthood. And inevitably, I've always thought about wrestling in terms of art, because that was the profession that I pursued. So for most people, when they think of wrestling, they might think of maybe 3 different eras of wrestling. So this, for a certain generation, would be their kind of image of professional wrestling, particularly British wrestling, Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks wrestling in the UK, and this would be circa 1970, 1980s. Or like me, maybe your earliest memories of wrestling, or your kind of thing that first springs to mind when you think about wrestling, it might be American wrestling, something like Hulk Hogan, the sort of superhero, muscle-bound, hyper-masculine world of WWF. Or it could be slightly more recent. This would be kind of late 1990s, early 2000s, an era when wrestling in America reached a new level of popularity and was called they called it the Attitude Era. So became quite synonymous with violence. Wrestling generally had quite a bad press at that point in time. So those might be the most common things that people think of when they think of wrestling. So how I got into wrestling from an artistic perspective was through my first encounter with wrestling scholarship. So in approximately 2007, a colleague of mine recommended a book about wrestling and performance practice, which was co-edited by my now supervisor at Loughborough University, Claire Warden. And this was kind of my first sort of dipping my toes into wrestling scholarship. The first time that I'd seen academics writing about wrestling from an artistic perspective. Wrestling scholarship is a very diverse field, so it's very interdisciplinary, but predominantly people come at it from either a theatre or performance perspective or through popular culture. And the kind of entry point for a lot of people into wrestling scholarship is Roland Barthes, who you can see in this photo. So Roland Barthes wrote an essay, The World of Wrestling, and it remains one of the most kind of engaging and important works of wrestling scholarship. And Roland Barthes' essay, The World of Wrestling, introduces the idea of wrestling being a pure spectacle, a performance practice that isn't sport, that emphasizes the visual and the spectacular. So Barthes is a kind of really important figure in wrestling scholarship. And for me, he's one of the writers that really kind of captures the excitement of watching wrestling. Although the wrestling of Barthes' time in the 1950s didn't have the same sort of soap opera that maybe contemporary wrestling has, the actual wrestling itself, the performance, was very much the same as what we would see now. And I really like this quote where Barthes compares wrestling to diacritic writing. He talks about how the wrestlers arrange comments which are episodic onto the body, so the body being the kind of medium for a wrestling performance. And that idea of wrestling as a kind of form of writing is something that it's the importance of things like gesture and the very obvious over-exaggeration of the wrestling performance. And then in a more contemporary sense, this is a quote from a contemporary wrestling scholar, Broderick Chow, which kind of captures the essence of what wrestling is. It's not, it is sport-based, but it's not sport in a competitive sense. It looks like sport, but it doesn't have genuine competition like, say, mixed martial arts or boxing. But it's not entirely theatrical, because wrestling as a performance inevitably entails a certain level of reality that theatre doesn't. In wrestling, when someone hits someone, yes, there's an exaggeration of a hit, but they do actually hit each other, unlike theatre. So wrestling is really the theatricalization of an athletic contest. And as watchers of wrestling, we're invited into this performance. So wrestling is this theatricalization of a match. And as audience members, what we're seeing is something that is both real and theatrical at the same time. And that's one of the great pleasures of being someone watching wrestling. It's partly improvised and it's partly rehearsed. And this quote is by Sharon Mazer, who's a really important figure in wrestling scholarship, and who kind of followed on from Baths and produced a really interesting text called Professional Wrestling, Sport and Spectacle, which is kind of another key moment in wrestling scholarship. So the performance of wrestling is, before I move on to my own kind of practice, is a lot like partner dance. It's based on the physical language of real combat, but it's a performance. And you can see some of what wrestling performances of wrestling moves, strikes, kicks, things like that. So wrestling takes place in the form of events. A wrestling event, a live event, will be composed of maybe 6 to 8 matches. Each match is a fictional sporting contest, essentially. And as fans, we're spectators of this sporting contest. So we're there to behave like a sports spectator. And so everything in wrestling has both a kind of performative role and an actual role. We're actually watching the wrestling, but we're also partaking in a kind of fiction of combat. So my research is sort of situated within storytelling. So I look at how sequences like these form together to tell a story, and then how the companies that are involved in staging these performances tell stories through. My research practice is autoethnographic, so it's drawing on my own experience of working in wrestling and my own experience of working in the arts. It's informed by my practice as a maker of professional wrestling performances. It's interdisciplinary because I don't necessarily come from a theatre background, I come from a contemporary art background, and wrestling itself is incredibly interdisciplinary. So inevitably it draws on lots of different fields and things like that. And there's an emphasis on the actual performance practice of wrestling. So rather than the kind of soap opera stories that you might see on wrestling television, my research is much more focused on the performance itself, the action that takes place in the ring, and how this kind of physical language of combat can be used to tell stories. So that's a kind of overview of wrestling scholarship and also a little bit of an introduction to my research. But before just moving on to wrestling resurgence and the actual practice stuff that I do, I want to bring in a little bit more wrestling scholarship, which I think is really important, because wrestling is a discipline that relies on fakery, on an artifice. And I think it's better in times, but throughout all of wrestling history, it's important to remain vigilant that what you're seeing is not necessarily true. And I really like both these quotes because they kind of speak to that kind of critical eye that as a researcher and a practitioner that you must have, and especially as someone who comes from outside of wrestling into the world of wrestling. I think it's really important to bear these things in mind.
Just to ask, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Just to ask quickly, how do you think, just looking at those 2 quotes, say somebody who is a younger spectator, a first-time kind of spectator at a wrestling match, how do you think that kind of naivety plays to that kind of, the level of falseness or what's expected of an audience, and how does that kind of change as people become, more aware of their role perhaps, or as they become older and that kind of, that the layer of kind of mystique and the kind of more obvious nuances of the falseness become apparent?
Yes, so kind of as I alluded to, as a watcher of wrestling, you are engaged in the performance of wrestling. So you kind of are there to play a part. And children are incredibly brutal when it comes to kind of cutting through the artifice of wrestling. So I've heard wrestling practitioners and trainers use the example of would a child believe what you're doing as a way of kind of enforcing that idea that really children are like hypercritical of wrestling because they can tell if it's being phony, if it's being overacted or overperformed. Whereas actually as adults, we're a little bit more ready to buy into the kind of fiction of what we're being shown. Because as performers, as adults, knowing that what we're watching is a performance, we perhaps are more enthusiastic in terms of playing along, whereas children actually have to are a little bit more, maybe a little bit more critically engaged. So does that help?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Sam.
yeah, we'll delve into a little bit more about the audience's role in a second, because that's quite an interesting, a very interesting facet of wrestling. I just want to play this little video. It will start with sound and then I'll mute it. Which, actually, maybe I'll play it with the sound. It's just a couple of minutes, but it's a good introduction to what contemporary wrestling is. So I started by showing pictures of Hulk Hogan or Big Daddy or Stone Cold Steve Austin, these kind of images that maybe are what popular culture or mainstream culture sees wrestling as. And I want to show this video, which is a kind of a mash of different stuff that we've done as a company. This is from the company that I run, Wrestling Resurgence, just to show you a little bit of what contemporary wrestling is and the type of wrestling that I actually do and the type of wrestling that I'm actually studying. Okay, I think that really helps, because wrestling is quite a complex performance practice, as you maybe see from that video footage. There's quite a lot of different elements going on there, and describing wrestling in language is actually quite problematic, I think. So actually just being able to show a little bit of what I'm talking about hopefully is helpful. So what you saw was Wrestling Resurgence, and the project and the company that I'm a part of and I continue to be a part of. And it's also the work, the practice that informs my research. So Wrestling Resurgence started in 2017, and it was at the same time that the book that I mentioned when I introduced wrestling scholarship came out. So that was co-edited by Claire Warden, who at the time was based at De Montfort University in Leicester, and I was currently at Art Centre in Leicester, along with my colleague and co-founder John Kirby, who programs theatre at Attenborough Art Centre. So the three of us met on the back of that book coming out, just to discuss wrestling from an academic perspective. But also at that time, we had quite a free rein at Attenborough to engage with the academic community and to put on events. And this kind of seemed like John and I were both wrestling fans. We were both interested in the different ideas that were coming out of this book. And it seemed like an opportunity to do something. We didn't know what. It was quite speculative at that point. So we met Claire, and the three of us got along really well and started to talk about the potential for some kind of wrestling event. And Claire went away and came back a few months later, I think, with some information about a festival called Being Human Festival. Being Human Festival is a sort of internationally recognized annual festival of arts and humanities research. And the aim of Being Human Festival is to design events that engage the public with academic research. So we thought, brilliant. We'll take Claire's research and we'll put on a public event that engages with that research, and we'll use wrestling to do that. So we applied to Being Human Festival and were given a small grant to put on a live wrestling show. And that became the very first wrestling show that I ever worked on and the Wrestling Resurgence ever produced. So it was a free academic event. We staged 3 different matches. And then after that, we had all the wrestlers in the ring for a post-show Q&A. So it's very much like a kind of art event, like how you present performance art, I think, really. And had quite a formal and academic feel to it, whilst at the same time still being wrestling and still being quite engaging. After that event, the people that were involved in producing it, we all kind of, and I think this is probably the story for a lot of people that end up in wrestling, we enjoyed it so much and we couldn't imagine not doing it again. I think within the immediate aftermath of that event, we all were saying, can we do this again as soon as possible? And luckily, Claire's really good at getting funding. So she just went away to De Montfort University this time and got some more funding. And we came back in May the following year. So it's about 3 or 4 months between, four or 5 months in between the shows. And we staged the same kind of format again, but this time we went for a kind of stronger thematic. So we decided to explore character and characterization and the kind of artistic elements of wrestling within a wrestling show with a Q&A afterwards. And this worked really well. Our relationship with the people that were involved in the first show continued. We got a little bit more versed in how to run a wrestling show. We tweaked the presentation. This also took place at Edinburgh Arts Centre. And it was deemed generally to be a success. And after that, again, we were left with this desire to kind of continue to put on these events. And we decided to go in, basically set up a fully commercial company, wrestling company, that would act more like an art organisation than a traditional wrestling company.
Do you think?
Sorry.
I was going to say, do you think then, Sam, that your experience and background in the arts has been able to support you to do something maybe a little bit different or unique, or to be able to push this forward? Like you say, in terms of the organisations you've been able to work with, the spaces, and your knowledge of applying for arts funding, has that in any way, shaped the form that the company's taken, or the kind of events that you've delivered so far, which seem quite varied?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of us that were involved in running Resurgence came from arts backgrounds. So we had experience of events management, experience of writing grant applications, marketing, social media, digital content, all of these different kind of things that we maybe take for granted a little bit working in the arts. So we had this kind of skill set, and not myself, but John had a theatre background, Claire's background's in theatre. A lot of the people that came on board to help with those events were people from theatre backgrounds. So we had a very strong skill set right from the start, and also we had this kind of shared passion for wrestling and sort of belief that wrestling was as valid as other art forms that we were working with in our professional context. So that remains a kind of aim of Resurgence, and this is why doing events like this is so great. We aim to kind of reach out and take wrestling into different contexts and build a wider appreciation from it. But certainly those things influence our approach to wrestling. So yeah, our approach is essentially that we're theatre-led, so we apply the different skill sets that we have from working in the arts to wrestling. We work in art spaces, so that was quite an important part of the project, is that we would be in theatre spaces, art spaces, gallery spaces, because we know that like placing anything in an art context, it changes the kind of meaning of it, the interpretation of it. So that was quite important to us. And the different spaces that we've used include Nottingham Contemporary, Edinburgh Arts Centre, which I'll share in a minute. Collaboration has always been a really key part of how we approach wrestling. And actually, this is something that we didn't find was as common in the wider wrestling community. So because of my long-standing kind of career missionary, working with artists on one-to-one levels to produce work, all of those type of things are inherently collaborative. So the approach that Resurgence takes is very, very collaborative. We work with our wrestlers to produce the stories, to produce the matches. And then working at Edinburgh Arts Centre, John and I both had a lot of experience with inclusivity and diversity. Really a kind of premeditated decision. This was just kind of part of our ethos as arts makers, that it would obviously be inclusive, and we would try and strive for kind of diversity in things that we did. And then also we wanted to use wrestling to build wider projects, and I'll talk about those in a bit.
Sam, so how do you feel that the approach there that you've just spoken a little bit about has shaped the audiences and also perhaps the performers that you've been able to work with and who have kind of attended events and supported the project?
Yeah, the audience is a really good question, because I think as Resurgence has developed, we've retained an initial audience which were like an arts audience, which were interested in it when it was in that more kind of academic form that it took early on. And I think a lot of those people have stayed with us. And obviously we promote Resurgence through different networks that we have within the arts as well. So we've kind of picked up first-time wrestling fans, they would probably now call themselves fans, along the way. But then also we appeal to wrestling fans as well. And then we have a kind of local following. So our audience tends to be sort of three parts. We have that kind of arts audience. We have what we call like a national highly engaged wrestling audience that travel around and go to lots of different shows. And then we have our kind of like local audience. So we have quite strong ties to Leicester and Nottingham in particular.
Yeah, you mentioned that. I think I attended one of your events in Nottingham Contemporary earlier this year. Actually, I think it must have been February now. But I think it's one of the performers called Harry Singh, and he was from Leicester, and you could see, from the crowd that there were fans who had come to see specifically him, performing during that match, which was great to see.
Yeah, we do. We work with Harry's actually a university student as well, which is a nice connection because Edinburgh Arts Centre is part of the University of Leicester. But yeah, we do have good local ties to performers as well. And in terms of the type of wrestlers that we work with, we don't, as makers of wrestling that come from an arts background, we don't try and change wrestling. That's a really important part of what we do. Wrestling is still wrestling. It doesn't have to somehow take on the characteristics of contemporary performance art just because it's in an art space. So what we actually try to do is we look more at wrestlers that are out there that maybe embody those artistic aspects of wrestling in a very particular way. So someone like Cara Noir, who's in this photo, whose character and persona is based on the Black Swan, and whose background is in various different dramatic arts. So his character really does speak to the kind of artistic expression of wrestling and things like that. And the way we present the show as well is it's designed to kind of heighten that artistic experience and to be immersive. This is at Nottingham Contemporary, so you can see the benefit of the space at Nottingham Contemporary, the lighting. These are all kind of decisions and attitudes that we have, I think, probably come from our artistic, our kind of curatorial backgrounds, that we place quite a lot of emphasis on how the wrestling actually looks. So we're not changing what the wrestlers actually do, we're just not refining even, but just putting our own take on kind of how it's presented. This is Edinburgh Arts Centre, which is a much more immediate space. And the thing about contemporary wrestling is it's a very, as you know from experiencing the shows, you're very, very close to the action. You're very much almost on top of the performance, and the performers bleed out of the space. They escape the ring and move into the audience and things like that. So it's incredibly kind of visceral and intimate. And then, yeah, collaboration again is a really important thing. And we always encourage our wrestlers to come forward with different ideas, and we really want to be a kind of creative space. Not we don't try to dictate what we want from shows. We try to get involved with everyone. And that's what's led to our most interesting projects, I think, is that kind of sense of wanting to cultivate collaboration. And so these are just a little bit of the kind of behind the scenes. And we're quite, so wrestling, I mentioned, has this kind of great artifice of what is real and fake. And Resurgence, and in contemporary wrestling in general, that's, everyone kind of knows they're sort of smart to the performance. So we don't try and hide that. We actually try and kind of celebrate the skill of the practitioners that we're working with, rather than kind of in some way maintain that what people are watching is real rather than a constructed art form. And then the inclusivity and diversity. So one of the ways that we express this, I think, is in our presentation, particularly of women's wrestling. So women's wrestling has had a particularly problematic kind of history in various different kind of forms of wrestling, particularly in America. And often, traditionally, women's wrestling has been somewhat marginalized in terms of its women wrestling matches would be put early on the card and not given the kind of same treatment maybe as male wrestling. And also, like a lot of wrestling cards in the UK to this day will only ever feature one women's match. So Resurgence, because of that background, we wanted to try and address that in our show. So our shows do feature women very prominently. We have men wrestling women, we have women wrestling men. So we do a lot of kind of intergender wrestling. We try and kind of break down barriers that way.
Sam, just to quickly say, just because it's been mentioned in the chat, that every now and then your audio drops out. I'm not sure. I know you mentioned you had a new mic, and I'm not sure if there's anything to do about, but maybe if you just tweak it up a little bit, that might help solve the problem.
Yeah, I'll turn it up a little bit. Hopefully it's not the internet connection.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, just flag it up if there is an issue with that, and I'll see if I can do anything more about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so those are some of the kind of things that define Resurgence's approach to wrestling. And I want to just now bring in some of my own research interests that kind of stem from this experience of being a practitioner and a maker of wrestling shows. So I just got a chat thing come up. Yeah, so these are some of the ideas that I'm interested in. The idea of trust in wrestling, feeling and touch, co-creation, play, and also the creative community around wrestling.
Sam, I'm not sure if you've seen the chat. Someone suggested maybe you could try headphones. I'm not sure what your setup is there at home, if that's an option.
Yeah, that should be fine. Give me a second.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's always hard to know with these kind of issues if it is relating to your kind of personal internet connection, which I thought it might have been the case for me, or if it is the connection on the kind of host part or an audio issue. So we'll see what we can do. And as I mentioned, yeah, if anything, if there's anything you've missed, we are recording the event, so you'll be able to listen to it again on our website via the What's On page. It will be on the event listing for today's talk. And as I think it was mentioned by a colleague in the chat, obviously there's going to be the kind of discussion Q&A section at the end. So anything, again, you might have missed, please feel free to ask Sam to repeat or to elaborate on anything.
Okay, I've got some headphones on now.
Let's see how it goes. Yep, can hear you.
Does it sound any better?
I mean, it's hard to say at the minute. It's perfectly clear for a while, then it has a little dip, then it comes back, then it dips. So it's a bit up and down. So I think we'll just see how it goes.
Yeah, hopefully that's not the sign of the internet connection. Yeah, okay, so these are some of the ideas that I'm particularly interested in my research, and these all stem from my experience of working for Wrestling Resurgence. So trust. The performance, and you'll have seen this in the film that I showed, wrestling is incredibly dangerous. The two performers are literally putting their own safety in the hands of the other. And I think there's something about the performance itself that, because it's improvised, because of the danger and the risks involved, I think trust is really interesting. And there's also this kind of bond that's built between wrestlers. So I'm really interested in the wrestling performances, which are incredibly elaborate and detailed, are actually often put together within the space of an hour on the day of the show. So a lot of people don't realize this. It's not in the same way as maybe theatre and dance. It's not rehearsed or choreographed. What wrestlers do is they like dancers, they learn a language, a set of language of physical movements. And then
say, Sam, quickly, that point ties in really well with a question that's come from Shaveen, who's one of our volunteers, who's asked if you have to have a wrestling background to get involved in contemporary wrestling, specifically only, if you only have a theatre background. You mentioned the kind of skill and the physicality. Is there a level of training or physical fitness that's required?
Yeah, so I mean, can wrestle certainly, but it is incredibly physical. So, and the dangers, these inherent dangers, have to be learnt through, as you would learn dance. So they learn through repetition. Wrestling schools exist around the country, and you can go and learn how to become a wrestler, but it takes a long time, a lot of training, and a willingness to get hurt, because it does hurt. And this kind of draws back to this notion that I raised right at the start of the talk about the relationship between theatre and sport. And they're not performing being thrown on the floor, they are literally being thrown on the floor. The reaction, the impact of being thrown on the floor is then exaggerated, what we call selling. So the wrestlers emote, they in the Barthesian kind of sense, they exaggerate the impact as part of the performance. But yeah, they do really hit each other. They do really hit the floor. And wrestling does really hurt. And this kind of comes into this idea of feeling touch. And this is something I'm starting to explore, but I'm only in the kind of early stages of. When you talk to wrestlers about wrestling, in particular, the improvised sections of wrestling in a match. The way a match will work is often the start of the match, there'll be this kind of chain wrestling, or exchange of different holds and moves. And a lot of that is just wrestling. So when we talk to wrestlers about their approach to planning those parts of matches, they often say, well, we'll just go out and wrestle for 10 minutes. So it's kind of like this, like ballroom dancing. If the two people know the moves and the different routines and formulas, they can kind of come out together without much preparation and kind of talk to each other and speak this kind of shared language. And obviously the matches become more and more elaborate as they go on. So they'll include semi-rehearsed spots, things that have been practiced out, sort of tried and tested different combination of moves to build a kind of match story. And then this leads into this sort of idea of co-creation, which I'm interested in. So not only are the two performers coming together perhaps for the first time on the day of the event and creating something new together, they're also creating something new in the actual moment of wrestling because of this kind of improvisation and lack of rehearsal. The matches can flow and change depending on any number of different factors. One big factor being potentially the audience. So how the audience actually engages with the match. The audience are there as well as co-creators with the wrestlers. So if something, say for instance, trying to find an example of a strike. So say like a punch or a kick, if that's not getting, or if that is getting a really good reaction from the audience, then the wrestlers on the fly will listen to that and they will build in more chops and kicks, more strikes based on the audience reaction. So there's this kind of notion of wrestlers wrestling with their ears open. So they're kind of playing off and listening to the crowd. And the crowd, the sound of the crowd, the reaction of the crowd is all part of it. And what you'll see, and and then this comes back to this idea of trust. These two wrestlers, Gene and Charlie, who wrestle for Resurgence, go out and perform their match. They perform this kind of act of violence against each other. And then afterwards, backstage, they're friends and they've been looking after each other and they thank each other for putting on a safe match, for looking after each other and not hurting each other. So there's always this kind of weird, like, on the surface, what you're seeing is conflict and violence, and then underneath there's this sort of cooperation and care and trust. And then playfulness as well, because wrestling, I think maybe some people get put off with wrestling thinking that they need to take it seriously or that they need to, what they're presenting is real and they should believe that it's real. And actually playful and fun. And at Resurgence, we've done that. We explored this in a lot of different ways. We have, this was a match which was predicated on the idea of getting wrestlers together for an art drawing class. So the match starts with easels and canvases, as any art life drawing class would. And then because it's wrestling, it descends into chaos. And wrestlers using canvases and things like that, weapons and all sorts of shenanigans. So there's this kind of inherent playfulness, and really what they are doing is wrestling, although a lot more elaborate, is very like play fighting, the type of play that we would do as children. And I think wrestling does elicit a sort of sense of childhood fun and imagination that maybe we lose as we grow older and things like that. And then, the community around wrestling. And again, like, I think with trust, with ideas like trust, with ideas like community, we have to kind of bear in mind what I said earlier about this sort of being wary and being remembering the kind of artifice and the fakery of wrestling. But I do believe that there is a genuine, the community that's built around wrestling is something genuinely interesting and really quite important. The level of engagement that fans have, the relationship between fans and wrestlers is always something that's really kind of stood out at Wrestling Resurgence shows in particular. That's not to say that you know that there aren't issues with that, like within any community, but I think it is still on balance the strength of wrestling. And then, so this is kind of entering the final part of the talk. I want to again bring in some more of my kind of research, particularly the storytelling aspect and how wrestling is used as a storytelling medium. So one of the, again, I've talked about matches, and matches are the kind of center of wrestling storytelling. The idea of two trying to best each other in a match that typically lasts 15 minutes and is decided by maybe a submission or a pinfall. Although this match is planned and predetermined, the match itself is the primary kind of storytelling medium of professional wrestling. And what we do then is we take matches, and in a process which is called booking, booking is the kind of act of creating matches and putting wrestling events together to form a series of matches, and then linking shows together. So what kind of comes out of this is this stories of rivalries, stories that are based on feuds, the story of a wrestler within a company across multiple events. And it's kind of like a long-term storytelling process, which is both designed to engage fans in professional wrestling, and also to give meaning to the different fights, to give context to the fights, add anticipation. And because wrestling relies on co-creation and this role of the fan, these nuances, this kind of building up of detail over time is what really kind of engages audiences and gets them coming back again and again. So unlike my experience in contemporary art, I think what wrestling does really well is it's able to build a community of fans and then take it on a journey with it that can follow the kind of rivalries and the stories of these individual wrestlers. And a lot of this is semi-scripted, unscripted. So depending on what happens in a match or in a live event, the stories will change. And as makers of wrestling shows, we will rearrange or change our plans based on what's happened at a live event. So there's always this kind of spontaneity and always this sort of need to react to what's happening, to how the audience are engaging or interpreting events. So in the same way that the wrestlers will adapt their performances within the matches themselves, as producers of wrestling, we also have to adapt and kind of take into account these different things. And a really good example of this, probably one of Resurgence's most successful stories, which was a rivalry between two of the UK's kind of most exciting women wrestlers, Charlie Evans on the left in the green, and Kanji from Nottingham on the right. This match initially took place in November of 2018. And it was just, it was one of the opening matches on the show. It was there to be an exhibition of wrestling. Both were very technically sound, exciting wrestlers. So we put them together with no long-term plan necessarily of where that story might go. They put on an excellent match. It got a really good fan reaction. So a few months later, we restaged that match at a different show based on that reaction that it got from the fans. And we added a stipulation. This time we told them that the match would be 2 hours before, which means that basically it's a best of three. So it ends up being kind of 3 matches within one. And that stipulation is designed to heighten the rivalry, to really create a rivalry. It then becomes the story of these two wrestlers to see who is the better one. It's like kind of Federer and Nadal, be like a sporting equivalent. Or maybe Ronaldo, Messi, or something like that. So then they go, this match has half an hour of, they have half an hour to fill of content. The match again, I think it stole the show. It got a great reaction in social media. Our audience were really excited about that match. And it started to generate buzz outside of Wrestling Resurgence as well. So in the wider wrestling community, this match and this story started to become something that people were interested in. And it led to a final match, which would be called the Iron Woman match, which was August 2018. So it's almost a year has gone by, and it's been split up into these 3 matches. And this time we give them a half-hour time limit, and the winner is determined by who can score the most pinfalls or submissions within that half an hour. And it was the main event of that show. So the story's kind of gone from something that was really like a 10-minute skill to something that's now...
You just dropped out there. Can you just repeat that last bit? Sorry.
Yeah, so it's saying that the match started as a kind of exhibition of wrestling skill, a 10-minute match. And then over the course of the year, it's built into something that's really highly anticipated, that's now half an hour, that's the main event, that's the culmination of this kind of story that we've been building over time and these fans are invested in. And it ended up being probably the most memorable and one of the most emotional matches that we've ever put on as a company, because of the storytelling. A very simple story. Wrestling storytelling is very simple, but really effective and emotionally engaging. And yeah, in comparison to my experience of working with other art forms, I don't think there's something that's quite the same.
Yeah, I read, I think it was on another article, perhaps something that you'd written, just about the kind of comparing or looking at both wrestling and the soap opera, that idea of storytelling in a number of episodes and series, and kind of, you say, building that relationship and seeing how an audience responds to something, and then developing or responding to that. And I think that what you've said just then really kind of does liken wrestling to soap operas. And it's interesting how, from what you've told us so far, wrestling seems to both borrow and contribute so much, to dance, theatre, sport, storytelling, soap opera. There's so many different facets that kind of build up this wrestling as a whole, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I kind of, one of the ways that I've started to think about this is this idea of concentric circles of storytelling. So you have the match itself, and the match itself can have these kind of micro stories. A story of this match in particular was that Charlie Evans uses a submission move which targets the arm. So throughout the match, she uses different maneuvers to work on his arm and to make the audience aware that the way that she is going to win is by making Kanji submit to an arm submission. So this is kind of little micro story of Kanji and Charlie's relationship to his arm. And then outside of that, there's this kind of story of this great rivalry, and we use social media to kind of spin these sort of textual elements around that. So there's this interesting relationship between sort of micro and macro storytelling. And in this match in particular, and I end using this slide, is that over the course of this story that we've told of these great rivalries, these two people who had never met each other until that first match have actually become great friends throughout that process. So that also heightens the sense of emotion. But the story of this rivalry friendship can also be captured in like a moment in the match. So in that match in particular, there's a part where both wrestlers kind of come to a standstill. They bridge up on the ring mat, which means they're sort of facing each other, and then they shake hands. So it's short that gesture of that handshake is sort of a kind of microcosm of that wider story of their friendship. Ultimately, one of them slaps the other one, so it's then kind of brings in that conflict and that antagonism. So that little moment becomes a kind of picture of the wider story. So that's an example of the sort of long-term storytelling that we try to do at Wrestling Resurgence, and these concentric layers of storytelling. And the other, one more point on this actually, on this storytelling, and actually what you picked up on in your question about the different genres and mediums that are influencing wrestling, is the idea of intertextuality. So for the fan who's kind of followed this story, they'll notice references to previous matches. So by using wrestling, you can build up these kind of you can use previous wrestling and the fans' knowledge of that previous wrestling to kind of appeal to their knowledge of wrestling. So in many ways, wrestling is like kind of wrestling with the history of wrestling.
I think what you're saying there, shows, it kind of comes back to what you spoke about with regards to community and making people feel involved. Like they've got that little seed of knowledge, like when you spot an Easter egg in a film, you feel like you know something and you're a bigger part of that story. So yeah, it can definitely help with that level of engagement, I think, and interest, and that continued interest as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the final bit that I want to talk about is just a Resurgence project, which I think not only encapsulates some of the most powerful aspects of Wrestling Resurgence and the things I'm most interested in as Wrestling Resurgence as an artistic project, and also my research, but then also maybe segues into some questions where we can look at the current state of wrestling in regard to things like COVID, perhaps other things that are going on at the moment.
Sorry, Sam, you cut out again. Sorry, you just repeat the last bit. So the contemporary state of wrestling, which includes...
Yeah, which includes things like COVID. Mm-hmm. So this project took place in October last year. It's called Everything Patterned. And so it was Arts Council funded, and it was a wrestling show which took place in Leicester, curated by one of our kind of long-term wrestling collaborators, a guy called Roy Johnson. And it was commissioned as part of Black History Month. So we applied for Arts Council funding to put on this wrestling show, to produce a publication, and also to commission a series of films. And the theme of the show was a celebration and exploration of the experience of Black wrestlers in professional wrestling. So the show that Roy curated for us was a wrestling event entirely made up of Black wrestlers, men and women. It was a kind of showcase and celebration kind of experience of being a Black wrestler in the UK. And the reason I think it's really important to Resurgence is because things like the publication that we commissioned with interviews and essays, the films, which were sort of in-depth interviews about the different wrestlers involved in the show, the role of Roy as a kind of curator facilitating this event on behalf of Resurgence and giving Resurgence to him as a kind of platform for him to explore and express different ideas that he was interested in, these are kind of all the markers of how an art organization would work, not a wrestling company. So this is, I think, the real strength of Resurgence is where we are able to bring things like Arts Council funding to bear on a medium like wrestling and show the different ways that wrestling can, that wrestling isn't just about men in spandex beating each other up. It actually has something to say about the world around it. And Everything Patterned, I think, was probably the first time that we really realized or utilized Resurgence in that way. And that's, I think, maybe a good place to end, because in light of the sort of background of Black Lives Matter that's happened during COVID itself, there's been recently a movement in wrestling in regard to the experience of women in wrestling called the Speaking Out movement. And I think, yeah, it's important to highlight ways that wrestling can speak to those different kind of political situations and things like that. Yeah, these are just some shots from that show. It was, again, one of our most probably highlights. This is the whole team after the show. And again, just showing that kind of community of creative shared practice, that's not just the kind of wrestling audience community, but also the actual wrestlers as a community themselves. I will exit the shared screen.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Sam. And what a great point to end on, I think, and a great point to kind of, yeah, open up into some more questions. So I think we've got a few questions here on the Q&A, so I'll just jump straight into them. If anyone wants to pick up on any points explored at any time throughout the talk, please do. So in terms of maintaining their public image and story, how do wrestlers negotiate who is going to win? Is this something that is planned before, or is the winner usually circumstantial?
That's a really great question. Thank you for that. So basically, as promoters of wrestling shows and producers of wrestling shows, we determine who's going to win. So in that case, it would either be myself. Well, it wouldn't be myself. We have a kind of group of us that work within the team that determine who will win and who will lose. So it's the wrestlers, like, the outcome's important, sort of, but it's not as important as you might imagine. The real importance is going out and putting on the best performance. The actual who wins at the end of it isn't really that important to the performers. It's important to the fans, and it's important to the audience. And as producers of wrestling, we have to kind of know our audience and know when they want something to happen, and when to give them that thing that they want to happen, and when to not give them that thing that they want to happen. And so often teasing is an important part of wrestling, and we'll do that by say Kanji, for instance, has lost that match with Charlie Evans, that big feud, because we felt like it wasn't the moment for her to win that type of feud or that type of story. And so, yeah, the results are more a part of the storytelling process than the actual performance of the wrestling itself.
Thanks, Sam. I think that leads really well into a question we got here from Rihanna Grant. How can you tell what is real and what is theatrical during the match?
That's a really good question. how can you tell? Sometimes elements of wrestling are real and theatrical at the same time, which makes it even more complicated. I think, so that's really kind of stumped me as a question, that one, actually. Obviously, there's a level of realism. They're not actually fighting each other. So if someone punched someone in the face with full force, you would know that that is real, because it would break the conventions and the rules of what you're watching as a performance. And I think when the rules and the conventions of the performance are really important for your kind of reading of the contest. So you know that there's this sort of instinctive knowing that what you're watching is false, or that it's not real. I think as soon as you enter the performance space, a little bit like pantomime in a way, you're kind of you naturally sort of realize this sort of maybe inherent, or something that maybe we learn through childhood, that we know that what we're watching is simulated in some way. But yeah, the real, often as someone who's watched wrestling for years and years and years, and someone who's actually there producing the performance, I can't tell if someone has actually hurt themselves or whether they're just brilliant at pretending to be hurt. So yeah, it is. I mean, it's part of the pleasure, I think, is in the trying to decipher the realness and the fakeness of wrestling. It's like magic, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah, that's another interesting kind of another art form or a form of theatre to kind of bring into this discussion, and the relationship that wrestling has with a number of different art forms, sport forms. Got another question here from Bav, from my colleagues. Have you encountered any conflicts between the theatre/choreographic decisions and the wrestler's wants or needs as an athlete in terms of decisions made around wins or losses? Which again, I think links back a little bit to the question we had earlier.
So yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, we pride ourselves on being very collaborative. So rather than saying to our wrestlers, you're winning and this is final, you don't have a say in that, or you're losing and you don't have a say in that. We generally, when it comes to big decisions at least, we talk to those wrestlers and we get their input on what they think, where they think the story is going. And most wrestlers that we've worked with are very generous in the respect that they're not necessarily out there in terms of like to self-aggrandize, or to like, maybe some of them are, but so a really good example would be we changed our champion in June last year, and we had a really in-depth conversation with the two potential new champions, and the guy that eventually lost the championship made just a really compelling case for why the person he was wrestling should win, not him. And that kind of swayed our decision in a way. So maybe that answers your question. While we determine who will win, so we don't necessarily determine how they will win. So the actual decisions in terms of like the athletic component that you mentioned, that's much more down to the wrestlers. Like I have stepped in a ring and I have attended a wrestling class and took part in a wrestling class to get a feel for the performance, but I'm not a wrestler. Like I'm not going to make decisions about the actual creative components of the matches themselves. That's where we rely on their expertise.
Brilliant. It's interesting to hear, how, again, thinking about collaboration, how you are collaborating with the wrestlers as well as them collaborating with one another. And just because you mentioned there stepping into the ring, I think it brings us into a question from West End Girl, which is, what role does the referee play in a match?
Actually, you went. Your screen froze, I think.
Sorry. Did you hear the question? Do you want me to repeat it?
Yeah, if you could repeat the question, that would be great.
Yeah, what role does the referee play in a match?
Brilliant. Yeah, so kind of like everything in wrestling, the role of the referee is dual. So it has two kind of aspects to it. It has a real component, a non-fictional component, where they're there to they have a health and safety role. So we have a paramedic and a medic at ringside, but the referee acts as a sort of interface between the performance and the paramedic at ringside. So the referees have kind of training and stuff to know to be able to spot things like head injuries and concussion, things like that. So they have a sort of role there. They're also a little bit like a stage manager. So they will know the outcome of the match, and they will have to they'll be in on the kind of performance itself. They might even have input onto how the performance is structured, things like that. In say the Iron Woman match that I mentioned, where there's a 30-minute time limit, the referee is used to give time cues to the wrestlers. So he'll remind them of what the time is, how long they've got left, that sort of thing. So he has this kind of they have this real sort of practical element. But then also their performance as well. They're there to perform a referee, because what we're watching is a performance of a theatrical athletic contest. So they're as much a performer as anyone else in the contest. So they enforce the fictional rules of wrestling. They're there to count the pinfall, things like that. Yeah,
I think that's interesting as well, because it makes you think a little bit more about the kind of wider circle of who is involved in putting together a wrestling match. You think about technical requirements, also the commentator, if that's the right term, who again I guess is performing a role in the same way that a referee might. They have possibly they're giving cues, they're working with the audience, and they're working with the wrestlers, which is interesting. Got a question here from Karis Fieldson. Interesting duality of vocabulary used throughout Sam's talk. Audience and or fans, does this vocabulary change within the art space setting? Have you experienced pressure to alter wrestling language depending on its situation, and is language important?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We haven't been I don't think we've ever felt pressure to change anything relating to wrestling because of the arts context. Certainly not from the institution or anything like that. The language of wrestling is complex because it has its own jargon, essentially. It has its own phrases for different things. There's a whole different lexicon of different words that dictate different or denote different things within wrestling. Fan and audience is a really interesting dynamic as well, because I guess in the same way as the referee, there's this sort of duality of the fan. The fact that, like an audience member, they're there to perform a role. As a fan, they're the supporter and follower. And I'm also really interested in the idea of like fans in relation to art. Like we talk about wrestling fandom, and we talk about fandom in relation to other forms of popular culture, like comic books and things like that. We never really talk about fans of contemporary art or fans of performance art. And fandom is a really like important part of wrestling, because wrestlers tend to be fans. They're not their fandom and their role as a professional wrestler are often somewhat inseparable, and also the level of fandom that you have can often dictate how you interpret and performances of wrestling. A bit like an artist in terms of their knowledge or the knowledge of the history of art. Like we would probably celebrate a contemporary artist's knowledge of the history of art, but we wouldn't talk about him as being a fan of art history, which I think is quite interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but yeah, there's definitely some interesting stuff about language. A lot of the language of wrestling, interestingly, relates to work and labor. So what we call the fiction of wrestling is often called a work. So working the audience, presenting something as real, which is actually fake, is called a work. We're working them. Another good word is heat. So the bad guy, the villain in a wrestling show, is there to generate heat from the audience. They're there to antagonize the audience and rile up like hostility towards them. And they call that heat. So yeah, I think maybe that answers some of that.
I thought that was really useful just to hear more about that relationship, the idea of a fan, and also those terms that I myself hadn't heard before. But Karis, please let us know if you've got a follow on to that in terms of Sam's answer. Just because you mentioned the idea of heat there and the kind of the role of the wrestler in building that. We've got a question here from Shaveen. Do the wrestlers have the same partner / competitor for the whole season so that they're able to develop that chemistry?
Not necessarily. Yes and no. That's another interesting question. Because in a sense, often they do form partnerships, because that's what we would characterize as a wrestling feud or a wrestling rivalry, like the Charlie Evans-Kanji story that I mentioned. But more often than not, they'll be working with different people on different shows. So we do consider it is like a sports league. So a wrestler once described it as like a soap opera about a real sport. So he actually used the comparison of footballers' wives, which I thought was quite interesting. But so wrestling is the sport, and then the story, the soap opera around it is the kind of relationship between the different performers. So wins and losses do matter. We often, for a shot, we have a championship, in the same way that the football has championships, the boxing has championships. So that's the kind of gold belt that's worn by the best wrestler. And that's often determined by things like their popularity or how unpopular they are often. And if they've got a lot of heat, then they often make good champions because you want to see them defeated and lose that championship. But yeah, I think for wrestling practitioners, finding that person that you click with, that person that you can have that great feud or that great rivalry with, is really important, because like you say, they get to know each other, they get to know the ways in which they wrestle, and then once they get to know each other and they know and they click together as wrestlers, and that kind of creates more opportunities for them to create more elaborate or more detailed or complex stories. So like Kanji and Charlie, they talk about that very first match where they first met. They'd only met an hour before that match, and the idea of getting to know each other in the ring, they went out there and then something clicked. There was this sort of, oh yeah, actually, what our approaches, our attitudes, our skill sets, they relate to each other. There's a connection there. And that's what's led to that kind of great rivalry. So yeah, partnership, collaboration, are really, really important things that I'm really interested in. And as good wrestling promoters, when you see those connections, those relationships, then it's your job to start exploiting them effectively, to monetize them, to get people interested in them, pay money to come and see those shows, things like that.
Great, thank you, Sam. Just while we're speaking as well a little bit more about the wrestlers, the performers, I've got a question here again from Rihanna Grant. How have women and ethnic minorities been treated within wrestling compared to white wrestlers? I know obviously this was something you kind of had begun to touch upon a little bit at the end, and also with regards to contemporary issues around the Speak Out movement. If you could, speak a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, like the experiences of people of colour and women throughout history of various different disciplines and practices, and just in history in general, their experience in wrestling probably on the whole has not been good at all. Wrestling historically in particular has had a really problematic way of dealing with race. Stereotypes has and continues to be really quite rife in professional wrestling. And women continue to be marginalized and subject to the different experiences that the different kind of experiences that they might have in other industries. And wrestling is a kind of microcosm of a lot of that different stuff. Like wrestling, I think one of wrestling's great strengths, but also its great weaknesses, and it's is this sort of close-knit community, this quite secretive, and I talked about this artifice, this deception, this quite secretive community, which is largely based on sort of charismatic leaders or like teacher-student relationships, and isn't structured. It doesn't have the institutions that, say, the contemporary art world might have. Not that that means that they're any less susceptible to this sort of stuff, but certainly there's problematic power relationships in wrestling, like I think you'd find in disciplines like gymnastics, I think boxing and things like that. So yeah, there have been so in regard to the speaking out movement, over the last few weeks, a number of women wrestlers have come forward with experiences of abuse in professional wrestling on various through to sexual abuse. And these revelations and these issues that have come to light really reflect a lot of the type of experiences that have been talked about in the Me Too movement. So it's really a kind of a version of the same things that have been brought to light through the Me Too movement that are happening in wrestling. And the strength being that with wrestling being a small community, these experiences have been shared, and solidarity has been kind of found and forged within the wrestling community. And there is a great upswelling of desire to want to change these things. But at the same time, because of wrestling's deceptive sort of reliance on fakery and secrecy, a lot of these things have probably been kept hidden for too long. So that's kind of a nutshell of quite a complex issue.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that, Sam. And if anyone else has got any other questions relating to that, please do share them. I think maybe that brings us into a question that I've got. I was rewatching some footage that I found again earlier, which linked in with an article that you'd shared. And it was speaking a little bit about, it featured wrestlers and audience members who spoke about their involvement in wrestling and how it has enabled them to feel a part of a community, or to explore and present aspects of their personality or sexuality or self that they may not have felt as comfortable sharing in their day-to-day life. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about how you feel wrestling is uniquely positioned to offer this platform or opportunity.
I think, yeah, it's a really good question. I think probably the community that's built around wrestling is not dissimilar to, say, the communities that get built around things like sport. So there's this sort of, but it differs from sport in that it doesn't have the same aspect of rivalry that, say, for football, for instance, you get very strong communities of football fans around particular clubs, but they're often highly antagonistic towards other clubs. So there's this sort of inherent conflict in football, two opposition subgroups of fans. Whereas in wrestling fandom, you get that same sense of kind of community, and you also actually get that same experience of being there as part of a live audience, of being part of something that's collective. But you don't have, you're all there supporting the same people, or not supporting the same people, but in a performative sense, not in a real sense. So yeah, you cheer the good guys and you boo the bad guys. But at the end of the day, when all said and done, you know that they're individual people and performers, hopefully. So I think there's a lot of solidarity that gets built around it in the same way that it does around other sports and things like that. Mm-hmm. And again, like I said, the size of this community, wrestling is quite a niche. It's a very marginal form of entertainment. So a lot of the fans that go to the shows, it's like going to see your mates. It's we go to the wrestling. It's a social enterprise as much as it is a spectatorship.
So do you feel that kind of enables wrestlers to maybe build up this persona, or like I say, explore these kind of aspects of their self, on the stage, which might feel more exposing, but because they've got that supportive community around them, and maybe they're wearing an outfit, they're wearing their makeup, they've got the hair, it kind of creates this this sense of security, or this kind of bubble, which enables those things to take place?
Yeah, I mean, I know that a lot of wrestlers do speak about the courage or the positive effect that being a wrestler has on them, the ability to kind of to produce this persona that's not quite themselves, that to exaggerate different character traits and things like that. Mm-hmm. And the thrill and the adrenaline of going out and performing in front of a live audience. And generally wrestling audiences, particularly in the UK, and particularly contemporary wrestling audiences, are very supportive of the people that they see performing. So we don't want these people to fail in any way. We want them to do well, and we want to support them to do well. And we want to add to their performance as well. We want to kind of play a part in making them as performers really stand out and be really great. So when a wrestler, when there's a miscue or a mistiming or someone gets hurt, you see these kind of genuine outpourings of concern and emotion from the fans. And I think that's where the inherent risk in this kind of physical danger of watching these people pull off these highly technical athletic feats that could end with really serious injury, and performing them well or performing them successful and not hurting themselves does build up this sort of sense of elation, or sense of genuinely caring for the people doing the moves and performing. That would certainly be the positive side of that community and that closeness.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sam. Just while we're speaking as well about collaboration, got a question here. Do different wrestling organisations collaborate in terms of storytelling across companies, or do wrestlers usually perform with just one company?
That's a really good question, and it's actually a really interesting part of my own storytelling research. So, because what we're talking about here is independent wrestling, these performers aren't contracted to any individual company. I mean, some are at a higher level. Certainly WWF, the wrestling that you'll see on television, those wrestlers are exclusive to those companies. But the wrestlers that we work with on the independent circuit, they're free to move through different promotions, and they're characters. They're very much like they're individual artists with individual artistic practices, and they take that practice to different companies, and their characters those different companies as well. So a character could come to us and be a good guy. Next night, he could be wrestling for a different company on the other side of the country and be wrestling as a bad guy, as an antagonist. And the stories of these individuals do spill out, and they do bleed into other companies. So Kanji and Charlie Evans that I've spoken about, their story, because of the successes that they had with us in Resurgence, that match was then staged in other companies, and other companies wanted to buy into that rivalry. And now that story then becomes something bigger than Resurgence. It actually becomes something that could potentially go anywhere. It could happen in Japan, it could happen in America. And the great rivalries do. The great rivalries are the ones that sort of span many, many years. And wrestling is capable of that really long-term storytelling that lasts for a number of years.
That's really interesting.
That's a really good question.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you, Sam. Yeah, it was a really good question, a really interesting answer, which again, I think unpicks so much of the kind of inner workings of wrestling that a lot of us, even people who are fans or spectators might not realise fully. And obviously, just because you mentioned as well about taking a match to another country, do you feel that there's a lot of differences between what you term British wrestling is to what you might see in the US or Mexico, for example?
Yeah, definitely, especially historically. So the contemporary period that we're in, contemporary wrestling is probably more hybrid now. It borrows from all of those different lineages and traditions and styles. But historically, British wrestling has had an emphasis on technical wrestling, which is the sort of wrestling that's closer to the sport of wrestling. So the intricacies of submission holds, catch as catch can, some of the wrestling that you might see in martial arts where they're looking for submissions and holds and counters, very kind of detailed mat-based wrestling. Whereas in Mexico, where they have lucha, they perform a slightly more choreographed, acrobatic style of wrestling. So they'll do things like they'll jump from the top ropes, they'll use the ropes as springboards for doing flips and moonsaults and various different acrobatic kind of elements. And their sequences tend to be a little bit more choreographed, so they might look a little bit more like the combat that you would see in an action movie. Still very detailed, incredibly athletic and elaborate, but a little bit more pre-rehearsed than, say, British wrestling, which was a little bit much more improvised, hold for hold. And American wrestling tends to be a little bit kind of bigger, takes elements of those catch moves, has a little bit of a slower pace, more kind of slams, more moves where the wrestlers are picking each other up. And then in Japan, which is another country that has a really rich and still continues to have an incredibly rich wrestling history, you see stuff that blends a little bit more martial arts. So Japanese wrestling is known for being particularly realistic, very hard hitting. Strikes and the punches have a lot more kind of emphasis and meaning, more symbolic meaning than in other traditions. But today, contemporary wrestling borrows from all of those different traditions.
Great, thank you, Sam. That was a really detailed response. Just to say, we've got less than 10 minutes left now before we come to an end. So we've got 3 questions here still in the chat. So I'll finish up those 3, and I think we'll bring things to a close. So, is the fictional aspect of the matches a taboo subject?
Historically, yes. In the contemporary sense, no. Well, maybe for some traditionalists. It's a really good question, because obviously I've talked about this deceptive nature of this artifice, and there's a term that's actually used to kind of relationship between the real and the fictional, which is called kayfabe. And kayfabe is the idea of protecting wrestling, the inner workings of wrestling, sort of maintaining the illusion that what you see is real, hiding the trick. And in a historic context, wrestlers and wrestling companies would go to incredibly elaborate measures to protect wrestling, protect the secrecy of wrestling. Things like bad guys would never be seen socializing with good guys outside of wrestling. They would have separate hotels even in America. That was how committed they were to maintaining the idea that wrestling was real. Whereas today, through social media, the opening out of the sport as a kind of artistic practice as much as a real sport, All of those things are sort of, they're still there, but they're there more as a tool, I think. They're more the ways that we try and conceal things, the ways that we use kayfabe to protect storylines and things like that, is a much more playful use of that. So we try to play along with the idea that what we're protecting is something that's real, rather than being draconian about it or dictatorial about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's it's really interesting, like you say, like for everything, it's interesting how those views or the way in which, like you say, you're tackling them have kind of have changed over time with the history of wrestling. So we're going on to another question we have here. Have you received any pushback on wrestling being brought into the contemporary art world?
Yeah, so that's a good question, which I've thought about quite a lot, actually. Yeah, because there is perhaps an accusation that could be made that there's an element of maybe gentrifying or some way taking something that's working class and making it somehow elitist. One of the reasons why I think it's important that we don't, as producers, we don't change wrestling. The wrestling that happens at Nottingham Contemporary and the performance space there is still wrestling. It's not a contemporary choreographer's interpretation of wrestling. It's still wrestling. And the fans that come to those shows are a mix of wrestling and art fans. So I think putting wrestling in an art gallery does change wrestling, but I don't think it changes it in a negative way. I think often people struggle with particularly with independent wrestling. If you watch independent wrestling in a leisure centre where it can often be staged, or a working men's club, like I personally love going to those sort of shows, but I'm quite an avid, highly engaged fan, so I can kind of see through the fact that it's in a gymnasium. Whereas for a lot of people that are new to the sport, if it's in a gym with no lighting, it kind of ruins a little bit of that sort of that artifice that we were talking about earlier. So I think wrestling definitely benefits from all of the structural, technical kind of things that you can accomplish in an art space. And all of the wrestlers that we work with that come and work in these spaces, they love working in these spaces because, you know, they know that it's going to make it makes their work look good, to be well lit, to be well presented, to be in a contemporary art gallery. So it's a little bit like curating. We wouldn't change an artwork entering into the gallery. We would think about how we present it.
That's yeah, a really interesting comparison, Sam. And just before we end on Shabin's question, just because I think we touched on COVID briefly, and I think that this question that I've got here kind of relates to that, and also to what you've just said. So continuing and considering with that observation, and again the level of engagement expected from and demonstrated by the audience, and the kind of the technical requirements and the venue, is there a way for wrestling to be enjoyed by both the performers and the audience away from packed shows and in sizable venues and moving things online? How is there anything that can be done at this present moment to think about how these things can be reimagined for a different an online kind of viewership?
That's a really good question. We've not touched too much on COVID. And I actually think this is I've talked quite a bit about how maybe the arts or our experience of working in the arts can benefit wrestling in its presentation. But actually wrestling's use of the digital, of online, can actually lead the way, I think, in terms of how the arts deal with COVID. Not monetarily, but certainly in terms of presentation. Because all wrestling shows, even on like the lowest budgets, tend to be recorded. The matches tend to be recorded and put on YouTube and have things like commentary added to them. And they tend to be sold as well. So we at Resurgence, we record all our events, we sell them on Vimeo. Loads of little tiny wrestling companies run by 2 or 3 people in their spare time have video on demand subscription services that you can access online and watch their content. I don't know if, even the biggest art centers and theaters and producers of art content don't necessarily have that. So wrestling really does have a lot to offer in terms of how the arts can make the most of digital content. But at the same time, there remains this problem for both spheres, which is how you monetize that. And certainly the level of money available through on-demand and digital services is very small in comparison to live ticket sales. So really, wrestling's going to struggle without having a live attendee, a live audience.
That's really, it's really interesting, and I think it also brings it back to what we discussed earlier around, you know, collaboration and, like you say, wrestling world speaking with, you know, theatre, performing arts, the wider arts world, to kind of you know, share these conversations and learn from one another to work out the best solutions, and, like you say, ways that audiences can still feel engaged, performers can still feel valued, and, you know, necessarily money can still be made, I guess. So I think it's really useful that you've touched on that. Just as we're drawing to an end, we'll finish on a question here from Shaveen, which takes us back a little bit to yeah, conversations around the speaking out movement and other wider conversations around that topic. Do you think that female wrestling is sometimes over-sexualized compared to male wrestling? And do you think this causes some people not to take female wrestling as serious?
Again, certainly historically, that would definitely be the case, particularly in regard to American wrestling and the biggest producer of wrestling, WWF, who have a lot to answer for in many different ways. But from probably maybe like 2016, there was a really major shift in the way that WWE presented women's wrestling, which was to turn that on its head. And they were, you know, in their defense, very active about trying to change the way that they presented women's wrestling. They called it at the time the Women's Revolution, which was a little bit problematic and kind of marketing speak. But the actual way in which they've showcased women wrestlers since then has been really quite strong. And certainly the way that in Resurgence, that's not something that we've ever encountered. Our wrestlers are wrestlers, which is why we do things like intergender wrestling, because for us, it's a fiction, it's a sport. Wonder Woman could beat up Batman, and Batman could beat up, Batman could beat up Wonder Woman. Fiction, because it's a story, and we accept that these people are powerful, and what they're doing is telling a story. And then recently I saw, actually just today on social media, a couple of fans or wrestling critics talking about how women's wrestling in WWF has been the kind of lifeblood of the recent COVID situation. The recent shows with no fans, they were saying that it's been really the women performers that have stood out just on their wrestling ability. And I think there's not been a better time in the history of wrestling for women's wrestling than there is now. There's an extraordinary level of depth of talent in the UK, in America, at the biggest stage and on the smallest stages as well. Which is why, I mean, to come back to the speaking out movement, the revelations around the experiences of women, in particularly in training schools and in these kind of unregulated spaces where wrestling takes place, this sort of learning of wrestling. That's why it's horrible and tragic that these things have been going on, but they need to be put right, and hopefully we're in a position where they will be put right, because there's so many talented women wrestlers, and those are the people that are kind of spearheading and leading that movement.
That's a really interesting answer, and hopefully a good point to end on. Thank you for that final question, Shaveen, and thank you to all of the audience who've joined us online. We really value your contribution, and again, if there's anything that you missed during the talk, or anybody who wasn't able to attend who'd like to see it, to listen to it, it's going to be available online probably by next week on the Manchester Future website. We've also got a number of upcoming events taking place, either live or pre-recorded, being shared online over the coming weeks and months as part of our Lincoln Live season, which I briefly spoke about earlier. So please do take a look on our website and follow us on social media. Thank you again, and thank you, Sam, for joining us this evening and for sharing your research and your practice with us. It's been a really interesting discussion, so thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed that. And I should give a little plug to where you can find some of our content, actually. So if you search on YouTube for Wrestling Resurgence, you'll find tons of matches, including that series of matches between Charlie and Kanji that I talked about earlier, which are well worth watching. There's also various different kind of interviews and documentaries on there that explain a little bit more about Resurgence. And you can find us on Twitter and Facebook and things like that, just searching Wrestling Resurgence.
That's really useful. Thank you, Sam. Brilliant. So we'll end the recording and end the session this evening. And thank you again, everyone. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.